Hey y'all, today we are going to continue talking about polygons, and we're going to talk about specific polygons. Today we'll talk about quadrilaterals. Quadrilaterals are polygons with 4 sides. That's what the quad means. That means there's 4 inside angles and 4 outside angles as well. And quadrilaterals sort of show up in different ways. We sort of have this family of quadrilaterals. And so if I start at the top of the family tree with quadrilaterals, I'll call them quads. We can split them into 2 major groups. One of them are the parallelograms, and the other group are the trapezoids. And so we'll talk about all both of these groups and then the different types of parallelograms and trapezoids that exist. But for today, we are going to start with parallelograms, specifically the group of quadrilaterals, the group of 4-sided polygons that we would consider parallelograms. And so I'm going to give you some properties, some characteristics of parallelograms that exist in any parallelogram. So when we break these out into even more specific names, you might know them already, but we'll wait till the next time. They'll have all these properties, plus they'll have new properties or characteristics that make them unique types of parallelograms. For example, squares, rectangles, and rhombi. But let's just talk about the parallelogram part of the family tree of quadrilaterals. They have 4 important characteristics. One is that their opposite angles are congruent. Remember, we give congruent this little symbol. That means that they are the same size and same shape. They're angles, that makes them the same shape. Same size means they're the same measure. And so if I look at this first picture here, you might know what this is already, but all we're going to focus on is the angles. Opposite angles are angles that are across from each other in that way through the parallelogram. And so in a parallelogram, the opposite angles are going to be congruent. So if this angle D is 90 degrees, then that means that angle F is also 90 degrees. The other thing that's true is that consecutive angles are supplementary. That means they add to 180. Consecutive angles are angles that if we were to sort of like, let's pretend I'm up here walking around my parallelogram. I'm starting at angle G, and I'm going to walk around on the actual like lines of the parallelogram. The next angle I get to is consecutive to G. If I start at D, the next angle I get to is consecutive to D. So if D is 90, E is consecutive with it, that means they add to 180. So we could find angle E as well. Angle E is 180 minus angle D. And so that means it's also 90 in this case. So consecutive angles are going to add to 180. So in this case, since my angles I started with were 90 degrees, that makes my other angles also 90. So any vertex, any angle here, if I'm walking along the actual outside of my parallelogram and I go in either direction, the next angle I get to is considered a consecutive angle. And so you can see the only angle I didn't get to consecutively is the one that's opposite, which is the same size. We know some facts about the sides of parallelograms as well. The opposite sides are congruent. So I can look at this parallelogram and say that this side that's 12 and this side that's question mark, they will be the same length. TS and UV are the same length. These sides are not all necessarily equal to each other. That would make it a unique parallelogram that we'll talk about next time. The other thing that's true about the opposite sides is that they're parallel. So remember, we use arrows to show parallel. That means if we were to extend these two sides forever and ever, they would never cross. These other two opposite sides, UV and TS, they're also parallel. If we were to extend them, they would never cross. And so if we were to look at this, we know this side is 12, so that means that question mark here is also 12. That doesn't help us find the other missing sides, but we can use that relationship of opposite sides being congruent. The other thing we can do in a parallelogram is we can draw these things called diagonals. Diagonals connect opposite vertexes. So angle P and angle R are opposite angles. If we connect them with a line, that thing's called the diagonal. So what we get is two diagonals in each parallelogram. And if you go up and we look at the rule I said, or the characteristic or the property, whatever you want to call it, diagonals bisect each other. That means they cut each other in half. So this diagonal from P to R cuts this diagonal QS in half, and QS cuts PR in half. So what we get are two segments here that are congruent and two segments here that are congruent. They're not necessarily the same as each other, but I know that QS gets broken into two congruent pieces. PR gets broken into two congruent pieces. And what happens here is that this point right here actually ends up being the midpoint of both diagonals. And so in this problem, it says that QS is 22.2. So QS is the whole thing. We want to know how big is KS. So if QS, this whole diagonal is 22.2, KS is going to be half of that. So KS is going to be 22.2 divided by 2, which is 11.1. So we can use these properties as we have for basically the whole year to find missing pieces. We can find missing angles. We can find missing segment lengths, missing side lengths, missing pieces of diagonals, just by applying these four properties. So these four properties are probably really important to write down. Of course, we'll add in an extra layer to these problems. We'll use some X's, we'll use some expressions. So you need to make sure that you're looking at the practice problems, because the practice problems will look like these ones, but then we'll put some in there that are a little bit more complicated that you need to get to. And of course, practicing and going over these properties is what makes us remember them and make them our own. So I want you to use those properties, and I want you to apply them to find these missing measures in these 5 parallelograms. As ever, if you have questions, if you're stuck, if something's confusing to you, make sure that you ask for help before you try and do these. Make sure that when you're done with these, you do go do some of the practice to reinforce the ideas. And when you're doing that, make sure you check your answers. And of course, always ask for help. And good luck to you.